right, everybody, I think we'll get started and others will probably trickle in as I give my introduction. But I am absolutely thrilled to be starting this first session of the new History Books at UNSW series, where we're going to be discussing and celebrating some of the latest works from historians here at UNSW. Today, as you all know, we have the wonderful Lisa Ford, a professor of history at UNSW, who's just released The King's Peace, Law and Order in the British Empire with Harvard University Press. This work is her third book and follows on most recently from Rage for Order, co-authored with Lauren Benton, and her prize-winning work, Settler Sovereignty. Given that this book covers experiments in colonial law, order and peacekeeping from Quebec, Jamaica, Bengal and New South Wales, I think it's going to be every bit as impressive in scope and meticulous in research and argument as these former works. I'm also really delighted to be joined by David Armitage, professor of history at Harvard University, who's joining us from Boston, and Alison Bashford, a professor here at UNSW. Both have extensive backgrounds in global and imperial history and will be responding to Lisa's work. Before turning to this, I want to give just a brief rundown of how this will work today. Lisa is going to start by giving a brief introduction to her book. David and then Alison will respond and raise some questions for Lisa, which Lisa will then answer. We'll then open to the audience for all your questions and everybody is welcome to speak. If you prefer to just write your question in the chat box, I'll monitor that and I can read it out for you. Otherwise, if you'd like to raise your hand, you can do that by at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You press the reactions button and then the raise hand button, and that lets me know that you want to speak, and I'll call on you then. And also just a reminder, if you're not speaking, to keep your microphones muted because this helps ensure that we don't get too much background noise. So without further pause, I'd love to hand over to Lisa, who's going to start with her introduction.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you, Naomi, or Alison, for having this beautiful idea, and Naomi for working so hard to bring it to fruition. I'm just so touched to see so many people here. Thanks so much for coming. It's just amazing. I know how tired you all are with Zoom. And I do need to acknowledge that I'm joining you from Gadigal land in the gorgeous city of Sydney. And I just want to thank the Gadigal people for the care they've taken of this place over millennia and for reminding me to walk a little bit more softly on it every day. Okay, so this book sets out to explore the intersections of crises of everyday peacekeeping with the transformation of the British Empire in the Age of Revolutions. It does this by exploring a series of contests about who got to keep order over whom and where in Massachusetts, Quebec, Jamaica, Bengal, and New South Wales between 1764 and 1836. Its arc will be very familiar to many of you. It follows in the footsteps of very old and wonderful scholarship by Harlow, Bailey, and more recently Marshall about the transformation of the British Empire in the wake of the American Revolution, the key marker of which was the shift away from colonial self-government towards proconsular autocracy. After 1774, the British Crown moved to govern empire directly, transforming what it meant to be a British colonial subject, white or brown, in the process. Here I argue that at its core, that shift was about augmenting the power of colonial executives to ward off revolution by keeping a better peace. It was a shift that had its roots in colonial violence, and its nature and limits were negotiated on a case-by-case basis on the ground. I've always been interested, as many of you will be aware, in the nexus between small conflicts and big legal questions. That interest underpinned my first two book projects. This book started when, for reasons that I can't even remember, I flicked through the crumbling volumes of correspondence from pre-revolutionary Boston at the National Archives in London, more than a decade ago. It was clear to me from these archives that the big arguments about parliamentary power to legislate taxes in North America were only part of the revolutionary story. Boston was riven by a deep and seething debate about whether and how the governor as chief magistrate could stop rioting and force people to comply with law. Crown officers in Massachusetts saw disorder in Boston as a direct attack on the king and crown. They weren't the only people who understood the problem of imperial governance in this way. Pundits on both sides of the Atlantic agreed that the king's powers to keep the peace were far too constrained in the colonies of North America. And that conversation shaped Governor Murray's thinking about how to manage a noisy spat between soldiers and a cadre of Protestant merchants who'd moved to Quebec after 1763, hoping to lord it over disenfranchised French Catholics. Disorder in Montreal helped Murray and his successor, Guy Carleton, convince Parliament that they should withhold a legislature from Quebec, turning its back on the constitutional commitments made in the Proclamation of 1763 and marking a watershed in the Constitution of Empire. The purpose? To preserve Crown authority to protect Catholics and to keep the peace in Quebec and in most of Indian country. Shifting gear, the book goes on to argue that slavery had also long chipped away at the limits placed on Crown power after the Glorious Revolution, because keeping slaves at peace was an impossible and impossibly barbaric endeavour. To keep the fragile peace, Jamaica's legislature actually paid the Imperial Army to militarise its countryside. Former rebel Maroons were kept under permanent martial law to hunt slaves, and white slave masters acquiesced in incessant declarations of martial law. They also generated new and usually lamentable experiments in racialised policing. Those compromises and those experiments travelled. So my final 2 chapters explore how governors used their new powers to experiment with what they knew were deeply objectionable methods of peacekeeping in 2 very different colonial projects. In Bengal, notwithstanding volumes of tortured introspection, the governor and council signed off on the use of corrupt spies and preemptory imprisonment to control rampant banditry in the countryside. In New South Wales, mounted paramilitary police and an extraordinary law requiring free white people to prove they were not convicts tried to control bushranging. The Bushranging Act was taken directly from slave colonies, where brown skin created a rebuttable presumption of enslavement. Empire had come so far since the 1760s. So in essence, the book locates and explains the causes and consequences of massive imperial constitutional change in the local. It argues that counter-revolutionary empire was built not at the level of juridical abstraction, but through the interfaces of crises of order, ideology, and practice. So in conclusion, and this is where I stretch a little bit, I'd like to think this story is not just a historical curiosity. Even though by 1850, empire had pivoted again towards self-government in colonies of white settlement and was resorting to increasingly despotic rule everywhere else. Its story about compromise by inches is a very familiar one to all of us. But I think these changes were also formative. Arguably, executive governments from the United States to the Indian Republic never relinquished the language of necessity and exception, and the routines of peacekeeping trialled in empire in the age of revolutions and after have continued. The British Empire may have gone, but many of us live among its ruins. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Lisa. It's such a fascinating work. I'll pass over now to David, who's going to offer the first response.
Thank you very much, Naomi, and thank you to Alison for convening this. And of course, great congratulations and thanks, particularly to Lisa. It's a very special pleasure for me to be joining you from the land of the Massachusetts people today to inaugurate what I think we are going to have to call the Neo-Fordist era, on the basis of not just the achievement of this remarkable book, but of the trilogy of which we may say that it forms the culmination for the moment at least. What is Neo-Fordism? Neo-Fordism, like Fordism itself, is characterized by enormous and wide-ranging productivity. This is not the productivity of the Fordist production line by any means, though the speed and the ease and the elegance with which the vehicles roll off Lisa's production line is almost as enthralling as those films of the Model Ts coming, streaming off the production lines. This is a more artisanal kind of production, and it's a kind of production which crucially and revealingly, and I think also characteristically, as we've now seen it in Lisa's 3 books and her many articles, combines the different scales in ways that make them both speak to each other and also mutually illuminate each other. Scales of time, scales of space, but also, I think, crucially as well, scales of narrative and scales of analysis and their inter-articulation. If when we are, as it were, at the mystical dinner party in the sky with fellow social scientists who ask us, what is it that we do as historians? What is history? We'd probably come down to a rough definition that history is a form of narrative that combines and projects analysis, or to put that more succinctly, analytic narrative is what we as historians take to be the characteristic of our craft. I think in that sense, if we can at least for a moment agree on that as a definition of what historians do as against our fellow social scientists, Lisa's work is exemplary of the historian's craft in combining elegant narrative, telling small stories, as she puts it at one point in this book, with analytical, that is methodological and conceptual sophistication, not as it were bookending those stories, but again, this is something very characteristic of Lisa's style, which has come, I think, to real fruition and a pinnacle of elegance in this particular book, of combining the analytical deftness, paragraph by paragraph, chapter by chapter, sometimes just sentence by sentence, woven through the narrative in order to illuminate the narrative and to make the narrative really speak to the mobility of the concepts with which Lisa deploys and also reveals in their historical contexts, and of course cumulatively builds up through a series of what in other circumstances might be called case studies into a picture which is both three-dimensional in space and dynamic across time as well, which is an enormous achievement and something that very few historians can pull off. This is not microhistory. I think we must insist on that. A casual reader coming to a book like this made up of 5 chapters, each beginning from a dense archival reconstruction and its narrative retelling, might superficially say, it's a series of micro-histories strung together. These are not micro-histories, these are macro-histories, histories of the macro which are given the granular specificity of the micro, precisely through that weaving of the analytical and conceptual and methodological sophistication of analysis into the retelling of the stories themselves, to show, and again, I quote Lisa in one of the many pungent and resonant sentences from the book, to show, quotes, how very local controversies of the piece shaped empire. So the ultimate quarry, as it were, of this hunt across continents and across decades and through archives is that big story which Lisa just succinctly laid out for us about the transformation of empire in an age of revolutions, which, as she's also very keen and I think very correct to tell us, is also an age of counter-revolutions as well. And that dynamic between revolution and counter-revolution, I think, is becoming one of the most productive focuses for historical research around the late 18th and 19th centuries, particularly, but not only, but particularly certainly in the context of the Anglo world of the British Empire, particularly in its colonial context, those contexts which might formerly have been thought of as peripheral, but as Lisa, I think, particularly among current historians, is showing that these peripheries are all central and increasingly central to the way in which we need to tell the stories of this age of revolutions and counter-revolutions, and the age of the transformations of empire, and the age also of the transformations of territoriality, of sovereignty and statehood, going back to some of the themes which were, again, so powerful and have been so persistently resonant and relevant, moving out from Lisa's first book. And there are clear continuities, I think, obviously, with that extraordinary first book, and indeed the book that Lisa co-authored with Lauren Benton. These 3 books do genuinely form a trilogy, not just because, as Lisa told us, the origins of this particular book go back to at least some of the period of research which informed even her earliest monograph, but rather this is an unfolding project rippling outwards in waves, and I'm quite certain that we're not done yet. Now, we've been tasked, as Naomi said, to pose some questions, to continue that set of waves of resonance outward from this grand unfolding project. So I'll just put three into the mix, and I'm sure others will occur in the course of conversation as well. The first one is coming back precisely to this dynamic of, let's call it very grandly for the moment, revolution and counter revolution. We might say, and this is doing some violence, I know, to the subtlety of Lisa's argument, we might say in the broadest strokes, what the King's Peace shows are the ways in which tentacular but ultimately homogenizing forces derived from multiple centers, all of them in a non-judgmental, non-evaluative sense, which were peripheral to the center, that the tentacular and homogenizing forces from those multiple centers around the world, from Boston, from Montreal, from Jamaica, from Bengal, and then ultimately from New South Wales, they all converged in ways which did indeed prove transformative to the repertoire of practices, particularly the practices of control, let's say in the broadest sense, that characterized the enterprise of empire. That there are commonalities which begin to emerge because of various forms of mimesis, of circulation, some of coincidence and convergence without necessarily any direct contact between the various centers that Lisa maps here, but nonetheless responding to some similar forces of the necessity of imposing order, and then the unintended consequences as these ripples of convergence take place. I think the most spectacular one that Lisa maps are the ways in which some of the repertoires of particularly savage control generated in Jamaica take on ironic and in some ways even more destructive implications when they move to colonies of unfree laborers who are white in New South Wales, for instance. I think that's a peculiarly illuminating and brilliant convergence, which would not emerge from any other technique from this other than this juxtaposition of, quotes, small stories, but when put together, the small stories turn into a very big picture. So with that big picture in mind about control and in some sense the homogenization, or at least the convergence of these practices across empire, I want to ask, just to pull out some of the threads which are more implicit in the book, but I'd like to hear what Lisa thinks about this. Were there common forms of resistance that emerged, or are there commonalities among the forms of resistance to these forms of control, which, if we were telling a different story, the story precisely from the viewpoint of those being controlled by the practices of the King's Peace, what happens when these homologous forms of invasive order emerge? Do they generate homologous forms of invasive resistance, of reactive resistance to those attempts at ordering? Is there a globally recognizable emergent suite of strategies of resistance, some of which indeed may be circulated in the way that the practices of order are themselves circulated, which are recognizable here? And of course, partly what I'm thinking of here in terms of that dialogue between order and resistance, revolution and counter-revolution, is the dynamic which Sujit Sivasundaram has laid out in his Waves Across the South, a book that just made it into your footnotes, but I think probably too late, and undoubtedly too late, really to affect the way in which you might now begin to rethink some of the dialectics of order and disorder in this period. And I wonder, perhaps on reflection, maybe in relation to Sujit's book, maybe just on reflection with distance on your own work, how might patterns of resistance, of counter-revolution against the revolutionary force of empire itself look similar, or in some senses converge? So that's the first question. The second one is an unsympathetic observer, which is not me. I'm just ventriloquizing this person just for a second. Might uncharitably say, the King's Peace is Hamlet without the prince, or rather, it is the King's Peace without the king. where is the king in this project? That's one metaphorical way of saying, how does this look from the center? What would happen if you had a chapter on the center? And it might be the center meaning Ireland, it might be the center meaning the Highlands in the 1740s, it might be the center in terms of the Pittite repression of the 1790s, it might be the center seen from the viewpoint of E.P. Thompson, Dennis Hay, and Albion's Fatal Tree, whichever way you want to take that. What might a ghost chapter on the center look like that would be articulated with these case studies? And even more precisely, and this is coming from some work I did a couple of summers ago in the Royal Archives at Windsor, I read all of George III's correspondence, the King's correspondence during this period. And I can say pretty much with assurance that he was, if not entirely unaware of almost every one of these incidents, he was also pretty much uninterested, not disinterested, but actually uninterested from the evidence of his own correspondence, even with his ministers, about these particular movements. He's very interested in peace. He's very interested in peace in the classic sense of peace conferences, pieces in the sense of treaties, the Peace of Paris of 1763, the Peace of 1783. He talks a lot about peace and the tensions of peace and peace in relation to his honor, the honor of the empire, the integrity of the empire. But I wonder what would happen if we articulated the king himself with the peace. In a sense, one might say this is a book about the crown's peace. It's about the peace of the king's agents acting in the name of the king and the name of the crown, but there is an absence in terms of the king himself. You have a wonderful line or phrase towards the end of the book about the vast discretionary cavern within which these strategies of order were forged and ultimately disseminated. I also wonder about the hidden catacombs within which similar patterns of ordering against disorder as it was perceived were being generated within the three kingdoms themselves, the archipelago. And I wonder how you might imagine that British historians of a more traditional cast looking at the quotes imperial center might receive, or you might hope might carry on your work in that area. And then the third question, extremely briefly, this is picking up the very last thread that you laid down in your opening remarks, but also at the very end of the book and the beginning as well. What's the status of the genealogical speculations that bookend the King's Peace? That is, how much weight are you genuinely putting on the parallels or analogies between strategies of policing and incarceration and hierarchical ordering and the forms of disordering that come through that dysfunctional ordering in the present, and their relationship to the genesis of those forms as you're seeing them in the late 18th and early 19th centuries? One might say, again, slightly unsympathetically, a great deal happens between, say, circa 1850 and the late 20th, early 21st centuries. A lot of things are overlaid and intervened, and one might say it seemed the dynamism of the account of the book itself might run counter to the assumption that what is laid down in the period tracked by the book can still be found in the present. Isn't it much more complicated than that, many historians would say? Or more sympathetically, can you cash out a little bit more about what you think was only generated in this period, which could be found in our current period, and has no other origins and has maybe been added on to prosthetically by other practices, but nonetheless, if we take away some of that those prostheses, we might still see underneath what emerged from that vast discretionary cavern that generated these practices in the earlier period. So laying those broad and vague questions on the table, again, I celebrate the emergence of the era of post-Fordism and look forward to more Fordist productions in the future, of which I'm quite certain there will be a great many. So warmest congratulations. Thank you so much for including me in this, and I look forward greatly to the rest of our conversation.
Thanks so much for that rich response, David. I'll pass over to Alison now. Alison.
Now I'm on.
Great.
Congratulations, Lisa. You know, celebrations up and down the country and across the world for this really wonderful book. Lovely to join you and Naomi. Let's imagine ourselves up and down our wonderful corridor. We'll be back there soon. And David, great friend of Australian historians, we look forward to welcoming you back to the shores at some point soon. I have to say, David Armitage, it's really difficult for me to imagine Lisa Ford in the Fordist 1920s because I have Lisa Ford, the great historian of the 1820s, so firmly lodged in my mind that there's a rich but difficult challenge there to put Lisa into that period. I'm going to quite quickly talk about three things that I especially appreciate about this very important book, and then two or three questions. The first thing I appreciate, everybody, when you come to buy and read this book will do so as well, I'm sure, and David's alluded to this, is its great reach across highly diverse colonies that I suppose are put together in this period. And I'm much more, as people may know, much more 19th and 20th century historian, so I'm always looking back to this period. And it is the case that I suppose Quebec and New South Wales and Jamaica and Bengal and Massachusetts are put together in that historiography that Lisa mentioned, but they're not perhaps put together enough, and certainly not in this way. And what I appreciate is being told and shown how dissimilar these places are in governance, in demography, in forms of law, but put into the same challenge of peacekeeping. What I appreciate is that Lisa Ford has this great expertise and knowledge to tell, as David says, a really large story from bits and also from places. And so I appreciate very much that there's this characteristic Lisa Ford display here of linking the largest questions, could there be any larger question actually, to, as she puts it, rivers and mountain passes and local sites, and actually what goes on very literal ground. And for a legal historian, I love that Lisa Ford is also in some ways, we may talk about this, a social historian who puts all these episodes, as Lisa calls them, on actual places and and we can imagine them happening. And that's a challenge and actually quite rare. I really appreciate, and I'm still on the first point, that this is a bit of a long history of the ascendance of the crown. And by saying that, what I'm suggesting is that there is a trend, I think, to write very large histories. We all know that. There is a trend also, and this is sometimes a problem, to write large histories that also claim a kind of a comprehensive view. And what I appreciate here is that, and I think I've got this right, Lisa, what I appreciate is that Lisa has obviously the expertise, but also the confidence not to have to claim a comprehensive story here, but to be able to have all this depth and these to be pieces towards our evolving understanding of this extraordinary moment and of the ascendance of not the monarch, but the crown. So that this is a partial story, but a huge story, told case by case, as Lisa tells us, but also told in the everyday. So I like its scale, but I like its kind of caution away from the kind of bids for comprehensive story that we read so often. This is a history of protection. It's a history of coercive peacekeeping. This is a very large story. Secondly, I appreciate the periodization here. And I appreciate that we have a pretty idiosyncratic connection here between early modern and the Glorious Revolution and the early 19th century. And I'm saying that especially to not entirely a group of Australian-based historians here, but largely, that it's rare to have New South Wales or Van Diemen's Land discussed, especially in their 1820s and 30s manifestation, with the Glorious Revolution already also in our heads. And I, there are many distinguished historians of this period amongst us here, but the more conventional periodization is American Revolution forward, or American Revolution as a kind of a late 18th century founding moment where the British Empire turns to something else. And in that imperial meridian, so to say, New South Wales history comes as a response to the American Revolution. And I really think there's something very novel here, that we have the Glorious Revolution, in fact, as our basis. And that makes the king to the crown shift really interesting. And although you've kind of folded this into that, I'm going to call it for short, imperial meridian historiography, I think you do something larger, Lisa, which is to give us the Glorious Revolution as a kind of a basis. And it's for the modern historians amongst us, that kind of throws us in a really wonderful way. Less so for the early modernists amongst us, but certainly I would say for the historians of colonial New South Wales, there's that periodization here that asks us to think afresh and to think again. Thirdly, just quickly, I appreciate this book actually as a pretty, there's a kind of a climbing up the back of the mountain here, and this other mountain is in some ways a history of freedom. And we have a kind of an odd and unusual, in the best possible sense, history of modern freedom here lying inside this history of peacekeeping, a new way to think about connections between convicts, unfreedom, and slave unfreedom, which is not unfamiliar, of course, to Australian historians. But I like also that your 1820s, 30s story is kind of pitched and pivoting actually around an unusual one, which is bushrangers outside the law, and how that connects to the long story of coercive peacekeeping, and it's a bit of a spin on unfreedom, which triangulates, and this is speaking very much as, for the moment, as an Australian historian, triangulates convict unfreedom, slave unfreedom, and this other story of bushrangers and unfreedom. So I appreciate that very much indeed. Questions, quickly. On the big picture, David, I was listening with great interest, of course, to your revolution, counter-revolution question. Mine was slightly different, and it is big, about this age of revolution and counter-revolution, but this is also the age of republics and threatened republics. And from the beginning to the end, just backstage or really offstage from this story, I had all those new republics and threatened republics in my mind. And I wondered whether, and they surround this, of course, they impact this. Quebec is critical here, Massachusetts, of course. And I wondered how, and this is to ask you to be even larger. This is what always happens when you write big books. People want you to be even larger. I wondered whether the story of the British or the English story of crown ascendance, whether that's an English response to republics and threatened republics, but also perhaps more modestly a question about what's the other version of peacekeeping here that's happening in this new phenomenon of republican governance where there's no king or crown. And so for me, that was the kind of offstage, backstage context that kept on coming to my mind, rather more than the revolution, counter-revolution idea. Related to that, there's a few teasers throughout the book about Ireland. And again, rather than seeing a view from a centre, it's a really interesting question, David, where you imagined Ireland as a centre. To my mind, the teasers in Lisa's book about Ireland, every now and then, I saw Ireland not as a centre at all, but in fact, actually another threatened republic. And I wondered, you know, this is to ask you to do even more, Lisa, like what if one of the mountain passes were what's going on in Cork or in Dublin, or, you know, what's going on in this period, imagining Ireland not as a centre at all, but as in fact, you know, as we know, the first Atlantic colony. And over this period, there are really deeply, as we all know, troubling things. And what's peacekeeping in Ireland as a colony? What might that add to this story, especially as we know when there's so many direct connections between the New South Wales story and other places, and what's going on in Irish politics and responses to coercive policing and coercive peacekeeping. So Ireland was in my mind, republics were in my mind. And the other thing, and Lisa and I have talked about this before, and I'm just flipping through because this comment that I'm about to make comes from you, Matthew Birchall. Are you with us? Yes, hello. It's Matthew Birchall, a very excellent historian currently in Auckland, and Matthew will speak to this, I'm sure, himself. There's this phenomenon, this is Matthew's PhD, correct me if I've got it wrong, about new company colonization in the 1820s. And there are, you know, not least the Canada Company in Upper Canada, not in Quebec. But it seems to me that I can't fit together the phenomenon of a resurgence of, you know, let's say the Massachusetts Bay Company with the Crown at one remove, even though they're chartered, in the 1820s, in the period when the Crown is meant to be ascendant. So I can't quite put those together. Why, after the Napoleonic Wars, as Matthew Birchall shows, do we have a resurgence of company colonization, chartered companies, where presumably the Crown is at one remove, right at the period when the Crown is meant to be ascendant? So that's a bit of the story that I can't quite put together, but it's your book, Lisa, that makes me think again about what that particular 1820s story is intervening. So 3 questions. One about, well, in a way, Protestant Catholic, but also Ireland. One about the Republic as an alternative to what's going on here, and one about this resurgence of company colonization. But congratulations, Lisa, on a super important book that was a pleasure to read.
Thank you both so much. That's so generous. Naomi, sorry?
Oh, I was just going to say thank you for those. There's a really interesting overlaps there. And I was just going to note that if anybody wants to flag any questions that they have, start doing that now as Lisa responds, and we'll turn to you once Lisa's responded. Thanks, Lisa. Go ahead.
Well, I'm not going to do these questions justice. I'm going to try to be brief so that all these other lovely people can ask some hard questions too. And I should just say that David actually launched my first book and was my advisor. So it is such a privilege to have him here. What a treat. And you can see why I invite him back, right? He does a beautiful job of making me sound good. So to David's questions first, the revolution, counter-revolution dichotomy and the notion of what's happening on the other side. And yes, I did just come across Sujit's book at the end there. I shoved it in a footnote and I haven't done it justice since. But it did, your comment did bring to mind, you know, Antoinette Burton's latest book too, which is inviting us to think about empire as a project, as a constant catch-up mode towards just the trenchant pushback of the colonized. Now that's a particularly, you know, South Asian focused historiography. I mean, it speaks mostly to colonies of significant non-white Indigenous majorities. But nevertheless, it's a really strong reminder. And I didn't do those people justice in this book. That's absolutely fair to say. Not anywhere, and everywhere they're important, right? You know, the whole question about peace in Quebec has this giant, much bigger question about Indian war sitting behind it at all moment, at all times. Like, they talk much more about pacifying the Illinois country in the Gage papers than they do about any of these disorders happening in these peripheries, which is important. That's a different way, because that's always on the litmus of war and peace. Very interesting. So strategies that they share in terms of this homogenization, well, it's very hard to say, because it is very much about geography and time and space. So the Maroons disappear into those, I want to go see those places, those remarkable mountain regions where, you know, you can fall through a cave shell with the wrong step. I mean, that changes everything. So retreat is a strategy there always, until it's not. But it still is, right? To this day, Naomi was telling me you can go book a tour of that country, but you have to find a Maroon person to take you there. But I guess the thing that you see across the space, but this is always the case, right? I mean, I don't think there's any special response to these special strategies. I guess the strategies get more invasive over time, but collusion is key in all of these places, of course. So who will hide you? Who will, like in bushranging, the key problem is, and that there's all these terribly invasive laws about being able to search people's houses, because everyone is looking after the bushrangers, because they're their, you know, friends. Often they're of the same class in this period. Collusion is absolutely key in the Bengali context as well, but I'm not going to spend too much time talking about it, because I haven't thought through that one enough to do it justice, but it's definitely an important call to rethink. Where is the king? Well, one of my lovely reviewers actually said, where'd the king go? And I did do exactly what you suggested. My answer is that this is actually about the crown. The King's Peace is just such a beautiful phrase. It's a phrase that comes up constantly. But that's also about a constitutional shift that's really important in the 18th and early 19th century, the movement of the king, the disappearance of the king slowly into the crown. It's not simple. And the crown itself is divided. And as Kirsten McKenzie and I have been doing some work on the 1820s centre a little bit more, because again, so many of us in Empire forget to read about the centre enough. We don't understand that enough. It's so clear that George IV, in addition to George III, was mostly interested in foreign affairs. So Empire is this space that's delegated to officers of the crown, but it's not, you know, necessarily in the ken of the king, even though there's been books like those from Bushman talking about how important the king is an actual figure, you know, whose mug is on mugs in Boston before the revolution, how important that notion of connection of Britain is. I still think this conversation is actually not about him. It's about the crown. It's about the powers that his office oversees rather than his person. And I think that gets lost a little bit in that new literature about Massachusetts in particular. People forget how important that conversation about crown power is when they focus on whether or not they loved George III or were burning him in effigy. I'll be careful about genealogical assertions. They're a bit glib, but then we live in this space where executive power is enormous, and we live in the period where Agamben has told us that, you know, emergency is always and everywhere. And in some ways, these stories are just a complication of that. I don't want to assert a direct relationship, although I will point out, and I took out a paragraph from an early draft talking about how paranoid George Washington was about crowds. And there's work going on now unpacking how much the early republic of the United States, and this gestures to Alison's question, was terrified of disorder and was quite liberal in its suppression of disorder. So, you know, the security is an issue, at least in the early United States. I can't speak to the Latin American republics. Yeah, so what does it speak to now? Well, first of all, I wanted to remind people that there are conversations, important conversations had at this moment. And I guess I'd really like to do this same work again in the Victorian period. It's not really significant pushback, but seeing how how law arguments are made and twisted by people who actually believe in lawfulness in order to justify these actions. I think that's an important part of governance and its unraveling in terms of freedom, gesturing to Alison's question. So in some ways I don't want to say I'm explaining anything much about the present, although I don't think executive power has got any smaller over time. And I think this is a moment in the Anglophone world where those attempts, which were very brief really, to define executive power, or to define the king's power and the crown's power at the end of the 17th century, that was a weird moment in some ways, although it's also a moment on a continuum of the growth of state capacity. So there's a complicated historical story there from the early modern period. Yeah, executive power hasn't gone away. So what are the conversations that were had in one of these significant moments of unraveling of limits? And that's all I'm going to say I'm doing here. Let's think about that. Let's think about inflecting those conversations back into this, against this notion that's all gone, that we have that there is only emergency and that there is no lawful power in that sort of modern sense. So that's all I'm trying to do, which is possibly too much already. Republics, I don't know, Alison, I haven't thought enough about that. I think I've just gave a little bit of information about the American Republic. I think republics matter. They don't want republics, but republics have their own problems of legitimacy and security. I think I need to do more work on them. I would actually like to be writing that project about the early national United States right now and figuring out how it fits into this project. I don't know when I'm going to get to that though. Yes, there needed to be a chapter on Ireland. They just did. But I really believe in 200-page books, and this one was already 240 pages, which is not a good reason, but I'm going to go back, just as I went back to Quebec, because everyone kept saying, what about Canada? How can you write this story about law and empire without Quebec? My next project about martial law will have material on Ireland. I will go to those archives. I will do that work because it is intensely important as a producer of routines of control. Right, so that paramilitary police forces were trialled in Ireland. All of these easy suspensions of law that were short of martial law were trialled in Ireland. It's incredibly important, and it should be in here. It is a gap. Company colonisation, yes. I don't know enough about that to give you a sensible answer yet, but my sense is, and this is from my early research, South Australia Company was one of the first places to walk in and say territorial sovereignty. In some ways, they became a paradigm of tidy Crown control in these places. Crown, what I'm meaning, is a powerful governor who's appointed centrally. So I need to understand, and I want to talk to Matthew more about this, and I want to really get my hands into his fascinating dissertation to figure out what the constitutional setups are of the companies. I haven't seen that enough yet, but I don't see them as in tension with Crown power in the same way as the Massachusetts company was by any means.
I would agree.
We have a question from Maggie, and then, I'm sorry, I can't see your name, Jean Neven. So Maggie, go ahead.
Hi, Lisa.
Hi,
nice
Maggie.
to see you online. So for those that don't know, I'm a geographer, so my questions are always going to be from a geographical perspective. I wanted to ask you 3 direct questions. One picks up on the idea that David spoke about, which is scales of narratives. And I wonder if there's a scales of emotions or behaviours going on around the peacekeeping, specifically because you mentioned compromise by inches. So I'm just wondering if you can explain what you mean by compromise by inches and what that is in relation to moving forward in peacekeeping. For me, it looks like there's some type of emotional or behavioural stuff in terms of keeping the peace, but I'm not sure. The second is at the beginning, and I haven't read the book, I wish I had read the book, so this is all just completely a stab in the dark. Can you explain what you mean by language of necessity? Like, what is the necessity that you're talking about? You mentioned it at the start. And then the last question is, how did you position and understand the colonial subjects? Or more importantly, was there a differentiation of the colonial subjects in the archives?
Okay, well, they're all really good questions. So I'm just going to answer them, revert to my case studies to answer this. So both the first 2 questions really are most clearly explained through Bengal. So the Bengal case is this very angry magistrate who's been basically demoted because he pushed back against the imposition of a special magistracy on his zilla. So there was a breakdown of law and order, which he hadn't even noticed, right? Which is just hilarious. But then these places are huge. There's hardly any police. Like he's saying to his policemen, you better do a good job or you'll be in big trouble. So of course they lie. Anyway, it goes on and on and on. He writes these angry letters about British justice because these special magistracies are imposing they're sending in spies who are pretending to be bandits. They're bribing people. They're bringing false evidence. Like there's lots of evidence that there's evidence that it's working in some places. There's been a decline of banditry, but at great cost. And he sends these tortured letters about British justice. And then there's this long conversation about whether or not this is the right thing to do, which is really quite, there's only so many moments when you get that sort of honesty in public records. So they're saying, look, we don't want to do it, but we have to do it. And I take them seriously when they write like that. So there is an emotional attachment to the notion of a constitutional norm. The same thing happens with the Bushrangers Act in New South Wales. There's long conversation about the rights of constitutional principles that are not applicable in this space and why. And these people want them to be applicable, but they also have this notion that it's not possible. And they also have the license to do it differently. So I don't usually think in terms of emotions, but there really is a strong sense of unraveling, even by the people who are perpetrating these shifts in policy. Necessity is a language that comes very strongly out of Bengal. We must do this, and in New South Wales. So there's an interesting way in which it becomes much more important in the 19th century. There's a little bit of it in Quebec, because part of the problem there is they've conquered Quebec, they go in, they've got no jurisdiction. Like that, it's so complicated. What is needful? What can be done? Can you unravel constitutional provisions or principles because of necessity? Well, in empire you can, because there's this fundamental sense you only need to apply those rules that are applicable. Add to that these massive discretionary autocratic governments, then you end up with a lot of space to play, and that language becomes more and more important. So it's like the language of emergency, the jurisprudence of emergency that Hussein wrote that very important book about, is linked to this notion of necessity. What is needful? What can be done? And what can be done changes remarkably rapidly from the 1760s through to the 1840s. Colonial subjects are different in every space, and I think, I thank you, Alison, for drawing out my attempts to try and place a stress difference. It's very different. I mean, the way in which even Indigenous people in North America are positioned in these conversations about the peace in Montreal, because Montreal's here, right, and Indian country is here, is very different from how Indigenous people's position in the colonial piece in New South Wales is. It's not totally different. There are some continuities, but every place matters, and the time matters enormously, because the resources available in terms of how you describe those relationships about order, it's constantly evolving. That's a very complicated answer, but I'm trying to get a sense of how the capacities of governance, well, capacity is the wrong word, but the languages and the things you can do have changed so rapidly, and that changes how you frame your relationships with people in space, with the significant exceptions of slaves who have been, like, for a century before my story starts, progressively more made more abject in the eyes of the law. Very vague, sorry.
Thanks.
Gregory.
Any of that looks very confusing. But this is just so interesting. I'm just wondering, Lisa, because the word freedom has come up again and again. When you're looking at these documents and reading the correspondence, is there a shared, I mean, it sounds weird, but a shared concept of freedom kind of across the board? And is it principally a freedom from or a freedom to do things? Is there some sort of shared kind of framework, or is it just kind of contingent on specific circumstances?
Well, there's a strong tradition of the notion of the freeborn Englishman.
Yeah.
right, which has come through in David's own work, the Free Britain. There's some great articles about how that unfolded in New South Wales. Alan Atkinson wrote some important early work about that. I think it isn't continuous. And that's been something that I investigated in my book with Laurie as well. And this is why I wonder what Americans will make of my Boston chapter. I think it will make some quite angry, because in some ways, even viewed from our perspective, let alone the 1820s, the claims for freedom from government interference, but also the freedom to do as one pleases in terms of trade, etc. They seem ludicrously inflated. And I use a bit too much of that language in there. I have a bit too much fun. I was reading this lovely old book by a judge, Hiller Zobel, and he's such a conservative, and he's just so horrified by the whole business in Boston. It's hard not to take that on a little bit, but but I digress. So the point is that the claims that they make in that time and space are exorbitant for that, even for that moment, right? They don't fit even within how the British regime is conceiving of what it means to be a subject, the privileges pertaining to subjecthood. There's a beautiful book by Hannah Muller that has a lovely chapter about the sorts of claims people are making to subjecthood in the late 18th century. And she traces them from really non-controversial things to completely crazy stuff. This space is something that people throw things into at this time. It's not defined. Subjecthood is a very complicated and evolving category. But I think that the freedom claims, people might use similar language in the 1820s to talk about their freedoms, but they're usually talking about much lesser things than the Bostonians were claiming. They're claiming due process, for example. They're claiming, the right to not have their property taken arbitrarily. I'm just thinking here particularly about the Rum Rebellion in Australia. I think the content of their claims in that counter-revolutionary moment is much, much, much less. And I'm here talking about Protestant white people. The other issue is, of course, that I'm talking about all these vulnerable subjects. I cast them as purveyors of new orders. So the notion that you're protecting French Catholics allows you to take away rights from Protestant men. So that's another variable. What sort of subject are we talking about? But even then, their privileges and responsibilities are unclear and evolving.
Thank you.
We have time for just one more quick question. Taylor, go ahead.
Hi, thanks everyone. Thanks Lisa for a great discussion. I have just a short pragmatic question pertaining to the archives, which you've mentioned a few times. It sounds like you've done there's a wonderful rich collection of archival material in this book that I'm very much looking forward to reading. I haven't read it yet. I just wanted to, if you could maybe speak to your experiences with the archives, especially dealing with these multiple colonies. Did you find it useful to kind of look at the British colonial archives more so than these kind of more colonial-based archival materials? Did you have any kind of archives that you kept going back to? Was there something that was particularly exciting or enjoyable for you? Your favorite kind of archives that you were working with, the most impactful, just pertaining to archives more generally?
Look, and this is something that I would like to be different about my work, but I'm not metrofocal, but I am interested in office holders and law by and large. So this gives me the extraordinary license, but also, limits me in many respects to metropolitan archives. So I spend more time. I like to find someone who's spent, doesn't live in Britain, down the road from the PRO, who's spent more time photographing material in that place. It's extraordinary, but it's also limited. So I started there. The British Library is similar, right? Now their East India Company collection is extraordinary. Yes, so this is very much a top-down history in that way, and I think that is a limitation. What archives do? I had a lot of fun at the National Library of Scotland. They're a bit funny about photographs there, but that's how I found the India case. Even though it's in the British Library, I was sitting down there, I was a bit lost one day, so I pulled out the Minto papers, and there were 3 volumes on that Ernst case. And they were so funny and tragic, because the life cost, like the cost for people of those decisions, but the way these men describe it, and Ernst is clearly mostly worried about losing his job. I find ridiculous, you know, the horrible histories at 19th century man. Well, I find them quite funny, which is what keeps me coming back to this period. They make terribly important decisions, but they often do it from such positions of ignorance or partial knowledge. You know, they're trying, but I always find those sorts of stories really, really fascinating. So that was a beautiful potted story. And the Boston stuff, I love reading those records. They're just, and yeah, again, for those quite cynical reasons, sometimes I just love seeing how they position themselves, because it's unimaginable to me. I can't understand their subject position at all. No, but I love the PRO, and I would spend all my time there. It's a beautiful, wonderful place.
Thanks, Lisa. I think we'll have to close there. We're just going over time now. Such a rich and exciting book. So great to start the series with this one. Just to let everybody know, we've got two more of these sessions lined up for the remainder of the year. In October, we have Martin Lyons, who's going to be discussing his new book, Dear Prime Minister, Letters to Robert Menzies with Richard White, and that's happening 12 p.m. the 21st of October. In November, we have a roundtable on Ruth Bailant's new work, Destination Elsewhere, and she'll be joined by Peter Gatrell and Sheila Fitzpatrick. And that'll be 6 p.m. 18th of November. So I do hope that you can join us at any of those, and feel free to get in touch if you'd like to be kept informed of them. But otherwise, thank you, and many, many congratulations to Lisa for such a fantastic work. Please join me in some virtual applause to her. Such a marvelous
Thank
work.
you so much. It's just such a cheering turnout, and thank you so much, Alison and David. I'll do more justice to your questions later, I promise.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, Lisa. Thanks. Congratulations.
Bye. Thank you.